Καλησπέρα σας. Hello, my name is Kostis Kornetis. I'm a historian. I work as an experienced fellow, a Marie Curie fellow at the Carlos III University in Madrid. I would like, first of all, to thank very much Paul and Adam for the kind invitation. I'm really honored to be here. And I would like to thank everyone who worked really, really hard to put together this fantastic program. So my exercise of freedom focuses on the ways in which torture and the private history of suffering can be analyzed through public history in Greece. I would like to talk to you not so much about how important torture was for the regime of the colonels in the late 60s and early 70s, even though I'm going to refer to this, but more about the ways in which the public memory of torture as a metonym of the entire dictatorship shifted over time. So I'm going to argue that after an initial period in which, right after the collapse of the dictatorship, right after 74, in which torture was actually seen as a privileged lens, a privileged field for understanding the entire coercive mechanism of the regime, of authoritarianism in Greece as a whole. There followed a period of relative nonchalance, with artistic representations of the dictatorship years becoming bittersweet, somehow becoming nostalgic, somehow becoming grotesque. With the onset of the economic crisis, however, the emergence of new social movements and the occupation of public squares, public spaces, led to a massive critique of the transition to democracy. Let me remind you that it was previously hailed as exemplary, but now it was seen as corrupt party politics from above, sidelining democratic participation, but also, and that's very important, silencing the violence of the past and, of course, the violent present. The time of crisis, I argue, therefore, gave way to a rougher and a more violent depiction and representation, a rougher way of thinking about the junta years, thus turning torture once again to a matter of public memory. So, and finally, I will finish up with one or two thoughts regarding the inescapability and reach of traumatic past into the current social and political landscape. But let me remind you some key aspects about torture under the colonels. Oops. There we are. The use of systematic acts of violence held a privileged position during the dictatorship years. These tactics were based on previous experience of institutionalized torture in Greece from the interwar period and the Civil War and post-Civil War years. Neni Panouria is here, an important anthropologist. I believe, I don't know, she has worked on this. Maybe she will refer to this in her own presentation on Saturday. During the years of the dictatorial regime, the human body became, to quote Michel Foucault, the site of political investment. A political investment of an entire political system, an entire repressive system. An authoritarian regime that resorted to violence and coercion and, of course, terrorization in order to assert its own authority. Torture under the colonels was mostly applied by carefully trained interrogators who served in the civilian and army police forces, the security police Asfalia, and the military police, of course, the ESA, with EAT, its special interrogation unit. That's where we are now. This is a propaganda poster of the time, and you can see on the left an Esadis, of course, an ESA guy, showing the way in which people should move forward, which is, of course, always on the right. Both Asfalia and Essa were notorious for combining complete isolation and interrogation with ruthless torture. Amnesty International representatives, this is another interesting um, depiction here of two Essa guys in front of the phoenix, which was the symbol, of course, of the regime rising out of its own ashes. So Amnesty International representatives who interviewed a number of victims at the time documented 22 different methods of torture in Greece, including sexual abuse, psychological pressure, electric shock, and of course, phalanga, which entailed the beating of prisoners with iron rods on the soles of their feet with their hands tied. Moreover, the use of deliberately and stereotypically sexist and offensive language was a standard means of humiliation and dehumanization. Torture under the Greek regime was condemned internationally. In late 69, the European Commission on Human Rights took measures to expel Greece from the Council of Europe on the grounds precisely of the systematic use of torture. After the collapse of the dictatorship in the summer of 74, however, the condemnation of torture by the Greek justice system was not as vocal. Apart from the aggressive and provocative stance of many torturers towards their victims during the trials, the judicial process that took place in 1975, the judges themselves often showed a remarkable lack of sensitivity towards the victim's trauma and their need to talk about their experiences, the violence that was inflicted upon them in detail. Furthermore, the most notorious torturers received surprisingly low sentences. And this is precisely the moment in which armed organizations of the extreme left decided to act as avengers and to execute torturers, generating, in some cases, even sympathy for their cause and a certain tolerance towards their practices amongst large segments of the Greek population. Something similar happened in Spain after 1975 with ETA at the time doing more or less the same. There were many torturers who got away with it, of course, such as Makis Psomiadis, a guy who apparently used to torture Eatessa dressed as a priest, but who got never convicted nor harmed, and ended up becoming a well-known football tycoon, always with a cigar. And you can see that here. Nonetheless, the fact that torturers in Greece were not amnestied, as in other cases, following the collapse of authoritarian regimes, such as Spain, Turkey, the Latin American countries, but were rather put on trial, makes Greece stand out. Spanish political scientist Paloma Aguilar concluded on and talked about this remarkable etymological affinity between the words amnesty and amnesia. And she's referring, of course, to the general amnesty that was granted in Spain. General Franco died in 1975. The amnesty was granted in 1977, and it was, of course, this led to amnesia as well. I'm sorry, this is from the trial of the tortures in Greece, and I'm going to come back to them. And this is just an image of people asking for total amnesty in Spain in 1977, but what they were thinking about was amnesty for political prisoners. But in a very ironic way, this total amnesty was also applied, of course, to perpetrators of the regime and to the torturers. So amnesty slash amnesia does not feel well, for that matter, with Greece. Apart from the trial and condemnation of the proteti, the ringleaders of the coup, there was the so-called trial of the torturers. You just had a glimpse before, which offered a rare preliminary picture to a wider public in Greece of the ways in which the torturers were selected, trained by the Greek military police. Their methods, even their jargon became well known. They used the idiolect and phrases such as tea party with toast or tea party or Motorola. Anyway, these were all code names for specific kinds of torture. And again, this caused sensation to um, the general public. This is Michalis Petru, one of the most notorious torturers of the time, who talked about this during the trials. I'm going to come back to him right after. I'm sorry. Just to finish up this short juxtaposition with Spain, this is a little comic strip from 1977 by Carlos Jimenez, actually a great comist. You can see a placard there too saying Amnistía Total, again meaning for political prisoners. In Spain, during the democratic transition, given the fear of confrontation and the broad amnesty mentioned before, no one even considered the possibility of judging the torturers. And this is a great, great difference. And this is something to bear in mind. And maybe we can come back to that afterwards, talking in comparative ways about transitions. Not surprisingly, the intense interest in the experience of torture in Greece led to a publishing boom after 1974, precisely on this issue. An avalanche of publications, especially testimonies, actually, of people who were tortured. They were published at the time. So this was a very, very popular field which atrophied in the 1980s. However, let me just say that the interest in torture in Greece attracted wide public attention also abroad. This is probably the most well-known testimony by Periklis Korovesis, Anthropophylaces in Greek, The Method, in English, which was published, translated in many different languages, including, of course, English, but also German, Swedish, and so on. Alekos Panagoulis' detailed description of his protracted physical and psychological torture. And, well, I'm going to come back to that. You can see that Kitty Arseni as well, an actress who was savagely tortured at the time. And this book became a bestseller of sorts in Italy. One of the most shocking inputs regarding the microcosm of torture in juntas, Greece, however, was again produced outside of Greece. And that was Denmark. It was a Danish documentary in the early 1980s with the title Your Neighbor's Son, The Making of a Torturer, by Jørgen Flint Pedersen and Erik Stevenson, 1982. We're going to watch this right after this talk. This was a documentary that featured some of the most, again, notorious and most efficient torturers of the Greek junta, but also some secondary figures like guards, like Desmophylakes. These interviews in the documentary caused uproar as the torturers, and you will see that, appeared with long hair and bushy beards. So this way, adopting in a way the countercultural style of leftists of the time. This again, Petru. The documentary embraced the line that anyone, even these youngsters with the angelic faces and the hippie hairdos, could become torturers if submitted to the inhuman training and the inhuman treatment of a special training. The documentary's protagonists appeared as brutalized youngsters who are gradually transformed into these beasts inside the system of KESA, the military police training center, thus learning to love pain and in return inflicting pain on others. Following the lead by social psychologist Mika Haritu Faturu, the film demonstrates that, again, you had to be tortured in order to torture in return. And Petru here famously accused the entire system for turning him into a torturer, claiming that he and his colleagues they were victims themselves. And he appeared, very regretful of his violent pedigree, and he said that no one taught him real democracy and so on. Haritu Faturu demonstrates how communal rituals during the training sessions can turn ordinary people with no special circumstances to ruthless interrogators who think that they were actually just doing their jobs. This bureaucratic attitude of notorious or towards notorious acts corroborates with Hannah Arendt's famous idea of the banality of evil. When all this interest in torture and torturers receded towards the late 1980s in Greece, new forms of representation of the Greek junta emerged, especially from the 1990s onwards, whereby torture ceased to be seen as this privileged category for understanding the junta years. In literature as well, the issue of torture became marginal, with a few notable exceptions, such as Thanasis Valtinosis, Piperias Glastra, and Maro Doukas' I Pigada. Things seemed to change in the late 2000s with the unprecedented riots of 2008 and the onset of the economic crisis, as I said before, which not only politicized a new generation of Greeks, but also put into doubt some of the fundamental premises of the country's transition to democracy. What is more, and this is, of course, one of the most well-known images of the December 2008 events. What is more, a renewed interest in the junta was boosted as the period of the colonel's rule became a point of reference, both in negative but also positive terms. In the summer of 2011, for instance, a grassroots social movement emerged in Greece, just like elsewhere. This was the year of the protester, I remind you, rallying against the austerity measures of the government of the day. Their slogan, bread, education, freedom, the junta did not end in 1973, brought the past even more to the fore by adopting the most famous catchphrase of the Polytechnic uprising of November 73, of course, bread, education, freedom, implying continuity in terms of the Greek state's repressive tactics. On the opposite side of the spectrum, of course, the neo-Nazi party Golden Dawn was becoming increasingly popular and was promoting a certain revisionism regarding the junta years, arguing that there was not so much violence, promoting this kind of skepticism about casualties, torture, and so on and so forth. These events had an inevitable impact on the public history of the junta as they placed the emphasis back to the dictatorship years and back to politics. This is therefore a typical case in which the past haunts the present and the present haunts the past. Similar cases can be seen in Spain and Portugal in the European South, whereby one can observe a need for rediscovering the past right in the midst of the economic crisis, concerning past injustices, the recovery of historical memory. Actually, this is how it's called in Spain, the memoria histórica. And this is one of the famous images of an NGO which started to unearth this well-kept secret of the massive, the mass graves from the Civil War and post-Civil War years in Spain. And of course, we have Latin America, in particular Argentina and Chile, and I guess Diana and Anna they're going to talk about this. In Argentina, a project called Memory Under Construction, or Giving Voice to Forgotten Memory, sprang out of the turbulent period precisely of the country's bankruptcy. And let me just quote here from Memory Under Construction. Argentinian youngsters born after 1983, who in fact did not live that period of the dictatorship, but who today suffer from the system of economic marginalization and exclusion that the military dictatorship began to impose 30 years ago, want to know. They want to know when, why, how, and who. It is an urgent quest for remembrance, for justice, knowledge of the truth that even 30 years later remains elusive. However, let me just note here that a great difference between the various cases is the absence in Greece of an organized of organized demands of accountability regarding those years, most notably from local human rights groups and transnational advocacy networks, voices which are very much present in Spain, in Argentina, in Chile, and elsewhere, given also the differences between these regimes, their durability and duress, but also the different nature of transitional phenomena and the transitional justice systems. But there is a memory under construction in Greece too. And let me just give you 5 examples. The question of torture as a whole was brought back to the forefront by a number of non-academic works. The first example and exponent of this renewed interest was Ilias Maglinis with his novella The Interrogation, on a former left-winger who implicitly carries the trauma of his ruthless torture during the junta almost 4 decades later. The book almost coincided with a period in which the most important testimonies, like Vassilissis, Kitty Arsenis, and so on, started to being republished. And when a number of scholars were trying to reawaken interest in the subject matter. The story, again, is that of a 60-year-old man. We are in 2008. The guy is a former dissident in the junta period who was arrested, who spent time in Athens, and was brutally arrested and suffered torture, and interestingly, sexual torture, sexual abuse, an experience about which he maintained throughout these 40 years an unfailing silence. The story shifts to his fraught and disturbing relationship with his 30-year-old daughter, who is clearly haunted by her father's experiences, as the trauma is in some ways inherited. In Maglinis' book, the unspeakable experiences of the past are passed on to the following generations, not because the father victim has talked about them, but precisely because of his silence. The daughter literally embodies the traumatic past of the father because she's an artist and she uses self-mutilation as a vehicle both for memory and art. Taking her cue from Marina Abramovich and her famous performances, the daughter plays out the trauma of the father, the repressed trauma, by using her own body, not only as a tool for retelling, but also for a vehicle for understanding and for redemption. The daughter's obsession with her father's well-kept secret comes to a head at the end of this book, of this novella, when she actually goes into a very weird and very provocative meta-interrogation. She interrogates her own father, in inverted commas, asking him very directly, what did they do to you in there? What did they do to you in there, daddy? Interestingly, the idea that historical trauma is inherited and the legacy of violence can be transmitted across generation, even if in a non-verbal, in a non-mnemonic way, if you like, is similar to the concept of post-memory by Marian Hirsch, a famous term coined for the children of Holocaust survivors, actually a term describing the relationship of the generations after to those who came before. Post-memory's connection to the past is therefore a connection that is about imagining the trauma, projecting, and investing in an imaginary way. In any case, all this acquired new impetus in Greece, as I said before, after the December of 2008 and the killing of Alexandros Grigoropoulos, a 15-year-old kid by a policeman in the city center of Athens. And this was, too, a part of an ongoing intergenerational trauma. It corroborates well with Maglini's work, and we can talk about this, if you like, in the discussion. Another controversial book that I would like to refer very, very quickly, which was published right after this, about the experience of torture, but this time adopting the view of the torturers and not of their victims, was the book Vassilissis, Torturers by Theodoris Rachiotis in 2009, again about how someone becomes a torturer. Let me give you Rachiotis' own words on how he embarked on this project, because I think it's interesting. I quote, "I was born in 1965, and I have no memories from the junta years. But I wondered what kind of people were the torturers of Athens. Having decided to write about the perpetrators instead of the victims, I encountered two comfortable explanations: that all this was no longer happening, and that torturers were monsters. Both collapsed. I read everything that was relevant to the junta, the resistance, but also the press of the period. I read all testimonies. I learned about the docks in the boots, the length of the aguillettes, and the duties of the guards. But I had not yet visited the Eatessa until one summer, mobilizing all my nerve and a busy look, I asked the unsuspecting security guard of the Freedom Park for the key to the other building, which is open to visitors only twice a year. The label on the key read torture. I stayed in the building with the big windows downstairs for hours, walking on tiptoe as if there was a sick man in every room." The originality in Rachiotis' novel is that the descriptions are from the perspective of the Essa and not their victims. It is through their distortive lens that we look at the verbal and the physical abuse of detainees, the sexual stimulation of torturers, the rites of initiation, their idiolect, and so on. Again, the connection with psychologist Haritu Faturi is evident. The book tackles almost obsessively, actually, the details of interrogations. So the narrative is really, really chilling, and sadomasochistic torture, actually, is the crux. Rachiotis confesses that at a certain point, he was himself scared by the fact that he was writing about all these sensational details. So he said, I got scared by the craziness to touch upon the past of existing people. To paraphrase anthropologist Michael Tausing, the danger here lies with aestheticizing horror and surrendering to the seductive poetics of torture and terror. As Tausing says, in reference to Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, I quote, "The political and artistic problem is to engage with torture while effectively turning it against itself. That would be the true catharsis," he adds. As the novel does not, however, entirely succeed to desensationalize the torturer's experience, the much-needed catharsis never comes. But could catharsis be achieved through a diverse medium, a different genre, other than writing? When Art Spiegelman won a special Pulitzer Prize more than 20 years ago for his graphic novel Mouse, based on the experience of his father in Auschwitz, he was opening a door to the acceptance of illustration as a means of approaching the darkest pages of recent history. The graphic novel dealt effectively with the different layers of memory and time, indicating a capacity to write and rewrite history. It functioned as an autobiographical compass that meticulously recorded the most obscure elements, the most obscure aspects of the unconscious, including the imaginary, the dreams, the obsessions of brutalized, of a traumatized individual through the detailed reconstruction of his or her wounded subjectivity. This capacity to enhance history's limited representational abilities on the past is precisely underlined in the extremely dark graphic novel called Lena's Song by the French and Swiss artists José Luis Bocquet and Andreas Zeff. What is of particular interest here, as in the previous cases, is the return to the issue of torture by people who did not have direct experiences of the junta, actually people who are not even Greeks. The graphic novel is based on Lily's story, a film by documentarist Roviros Manthoulis. The story takes place during the time of the dictatorship. Manthoulis is a documentarist, a filmmaker. He lives in Paris. He tries very hard to make a film, a feature film on torture in Greece, together with Gilles Dassen and with Melina Mercouri as the main actress in the main role. The script deals with the true story of Dora Leluda, an artist of upper-class origins who was arrested and ruthlessly tortured for hiding the leading members of one of the most important resistance organizations called PAM in her home, and in particular, the left-wing composer Mikis Theodorakis. Leluda's despair during her torture actually led her to attempt suicide. Autobiography, literary representation, historical record, and visual display were grafted into one in this graphic novel. We can see the illustrations often being submerged in red background, giving the impression that the characters are dipped in blood. Such are the scenes like here of the Assad torturers giving lessons on the most effective ways to exercise the phalanga. At times, the unimaginable torture suffered by the heroine, including being plunged headlong by a helicopter into the sea, as well as the representation of the colonels, clearly allude not only to the Greek dictatorship, but also to the Latin American dictatorship. So it becomes a kind of a composite representation of many different dictatorships of the time. Loneliness, sadness, alienation, and hopelessness dominate the graphic novel, making it a privileged terrain for communicating the trauma of torture. The use of this medium proves both penetrating and potentially therapeutic regarding dramatic events. In stark contrast to this example, which entailed foreign artists, as I said, people living outside of Greece, who had no direct experience to the events they describe, comes another example, the autobiographic narration of torture. And I'm going to say one or two things about cinema and Alinda Dimitriou's documentary, The Girls in the Rain, Ta Κορίτσια της Βροχής, 2011, which is one of the first depictions of the junta that shifts the focus to violence, and in particular to torture, and specifically the torture of women. The main trope, let me say here, in Greek film regarding the junta until that time, with a few notable exceptions, was one of a nostalgia for a lost, longed for world, and a bittersweet sentiment. And I'm saying this not because these were films made by apologists of the junta, but because they were made by people who used to be adolescents, teenagers during the junta years, and they were very nostalgic, I guess, of their adolescent time and their sexual awakenings, and they were coming of age. And these are all highly entertaining movies, but again, what they promote is a bittersweet nostalgia. They don't focus on the repressive context. And these are just some examples. Giorgos Tseberopoulos' Backdoor, Kostas Kapakas' Urania, and Grigoris Karandinakis, Kariton's Choir. They all deal with the dictatorship, again, in a light and caricaturist manner, reminiscent in some way of the Commedia all'Italiana. This contrasts with filmic depictions of other contexts, such as the Argentinian dictatorship, but also the Turkish one, with films on the Evren dictatorship, focusing on violence and torture, encouraging an active reflection on behalf of the audience about the recent past. That is until Alinda Dimitriou's documentary was released, a film that zooms in exclusively on 57 testimonies, 57 interviews by women who are presented without names. Somehow the individual I is being subsumed within this larger collective we of the 60s and 70s. Often, actually, the interviews themselves were conducted in a group of 3 or 4. The accounts are extremely poignant, whereby the female body acts as an archive of oppression, resistance, and pain. Despite their length and occasional repetitiveness, they're highly informative regarding the multiple aspects in which female sex activity was disciplined and punished during the colonel's regime, but also before and after. This is Kitty Arseni, actually, from that documentary. The main reason I'm mentioning after is that the economic crisis and recent political events inform much of the subtext of the documentary. Dimitriou made a choice that was a direct political statement in 2011, given what was going on at the time. At key moments in the documentary, after some of the interviews recounted the ways in which they were brutally tortured physically, psychologically, and so on, Dimitriou made jump cuts showing images of police brutality in today's Athens, in 2011, in Syntagma Square. And this is an interesting moment because also the slogans that are written at the back both refer to the junta years. And I'm saying this is of importance not only because of the strategy of bringing the past and the present together, but because there is no footage whatsoever in the entire documentary. The only thing we see are the women being interviewed. There is no film reels, no footage, no photographs, nothing apart from this. So a very direct statement and an adoption of a current topos arguing that the respective mechanism of the state had not democratized after 73 or 74, and that there is a hard anti-democratic structure that has remained intact. Dimitriou therefore makes a powerful, albeit controversial statement on the supposed continuity of the Greek authoritarianism and its brutality. In the words of a critic, the film addresses the young who are once again forced by current circumstances to grow up abruptly, just like the young women of the anti-dictatorship struggle grew old from one moment to the next. In other words, Dimitriou's film acts as a metonym for the suffering of the female body, not only then, but also now, in biopolitical terms. The last case I would like to mention very briefly, as there is little time left in terms of this new public history of torture under the colonel's regime, is an installation by musicologist Anna Papaeti and sound expert Nektarios Papas at the Stegi Grammaton και Τεχνών, earlier this year, within the framework of the much acclaimed Hypnos project. Papaeti, a researcher with a long experience in the research of music as a weapon of torture, developed one of the most chilling audiovisual projects of the entire exhibition. And actually, she's going to talk here as well on Saturday about this at length. The visitor, but I'm going to say one or two things about the installation. The visitor would first read excerpts from the record of the 1975 trials of the torturers that I mentioned before, whereby the testimony of torture survivors revealed the widespread use of radio and popular songs as a means of torture during detention and interrogation. The visitor would then proceed to listen to 3 separate interviews with people who were tortured during the dictatorship, 2 male, 1 female, and who are particularly candid about the use of music, and songs such as «Θα πάω στη ζούγκλα με τον Ταρζάν» or «Άσπρα κόκκινα κίτρινα μπλε», played in a loop day and night in conditions of total isolation, as an effective torture technique that would lead to sleep deprivation and psychological devastation. The 3 narrators, actually the excerpts are recited by actors, seem to becoming the historians of themselves, thus somehow testing the boundaries between the autobiographical and the historiographic. Let me just quote. They were beating me and their faces became distorted. I thought they were my relatives. And I were asking them, Yanni, why are you beating me? Such was my condition. And on top of that, I was listening to that music. Τα παιδιά, τα φιλαράκια τα καλά. And θα πάω στη ζούγκλα με τον Ταρζάν. When I listen to these songs now, I get depressed. After listening to the testimonies, the visitors would then enter an empty cubicle that was made to be reminiscent of a cell, whereby a terrifying sensory experience awaited her as a trembling dim light and the sounds of iron bars would intermingle with sounds of continuous bell rings and buzzes, and the aforementioned songs actually distorted in a loop. My own reaction to this in the exhibition, after spending some minutes inside this cubicle, was in the beginning, I felt a little bit dizzy, a little bit displaced, but then I felt confused and in the end almost panicky. Hence, the multisensorial experience of the installation, that is reading, listening, and ultimately feeling, led to an overwhelming result that was true to the original form of torture itself and its outcome, but also made one reflect afterwards on the devastating effects of this sonoric bombardment on one's psyche under detention. A form of torture, mind you, that can hardly be detected physically. Hence, this installation was a powerful reminder of the lasting effects that torture has on people's lives, but also on an interrogation technique that is still operation in many parts of the world today, including, well, and it's been imposed by the United States too, recently in the war in Iraq. As Papaiti herself noted, I quote, I believe we tend to underestimate the colonels. We remember them through their funny speeches and their kitsch, and we don't think that they were capable of exercising such developed forms of torture. But on the other hand, that is precisely the power of this kind of torture. You don't see it, you don't expect it. And this is a crucial element, I believe, since the typical portrayal of the junta in previous years focused precisely on its comical side, the grotesqueness of the dictators, the ridiculous aspects of the regime, instead of the barbaric one. By understating the seriousness of everyday repression and by overstating the vulgarity of the regime, the kitsch aspect, a picturesque image emerged, reducing somehow the colonels into these cardboard figures of this light kitsch culture, which was highly trivializing. In reality, however, it's good to remember that the junta persecuted, censored, manipulated, repressed, and ultimately tortured in a very systematic, in a very methodic way, creating a heritage from which we are not entirely liberated at present. Having said that, I'd like to finish up with these images. When in February 2013, a young generation of anti-authoritarians, actually a terrorist group, was arrested en masse in the Greek countryside, the ways in which they appeared to have been treated by the police caused a sensation in the Greek public. In fact, these pictures appeared heavily doctored when they leaked into the press. Some analysts likened their treatment to, and you can see them visibly maltreated, to say the least. So the treatment was likened to the junta years, and in particular, a rare incident of January 1973, in which dissident students, among them present-day MP Makis Balaouras, who appeared in court with their faces visibly bruised. Are we talking about continuities here? We can discuss this. But the interesting chronotopical dimension of this, whereby the past and the present are intricately linked, is visible in most of the works that I mentioned. An obscure topic for some time, torture has acquired a renewed impetus thanks to these different genres that aspired to analyze this in its complexity. These pieces of public history this is a non-official corpus, of course, they can be weighed against the official history of a highly problematic and a highly contested chapter of recent Greek history. This new tendency entailed talking about the past by people who did not experience it directly and who often adopted alternative forms of narration by selected disparate material, different ways of narrativizing it, representing it, performing it even. Most importantly, they penetrate the past without indulging either in its demonization or idealization or sensitization, primarily by not surrendering to the distortions of the bittersweet, the grotesque, or any other, the heroic, epic, if you like, genre. The deposition of memories by people who underwent torture themselves, on the other hand, came as an interesting complement. All this not only informed, but also altered the way in which we tend to look at the dictatorship years, to think about the dictatorship years, to understand the dictatorship years. As theorist Patricia Felisa Barbatos notes, all these issues touch on various debates in current culture. The legacy of the protest movements and leftist policies of the 20th century. Trauma as both an individual but also as a collective phenomenon. Generational and gender perspectives on aesthetics and politics, and the political potentialities of art. Most particularly, they focus on the body as the grounding trope for all these debates, a medium of performance and communication that is used to explore the boundaries between the history of violence and traumatic memory. Finally, there is the issue of the third generation that rediscovers the painful pasts and instrumentalizes, if you like, the painful past. Namely, it's a conscious use of the memories. It's a mnemonic politics. A conscious use of the memories of the detained, of the tortured, in order to fight against amnesia, but also against repressive policies of the 21st century, neoliberal or whatnot. Thus, in a rapidly expanding public sphere in the Habermasian notion of the term, the time seems ripe to revisit the all too recent repressive experiences that actively haunted the Greek society and the Greek state. Even though in Greece there are no persistent actors and militants who continue to fight for their memories, like human rights activists, journalists, or judges, like in Latin America or even Spain recently, there is, nevertheless, I argue, a context of growing civic engagement a public still implicated in each other's trauma and a history which is not fixed but is constantly shifting. Thank you very much. We will all watch collectively in this space, which has its own significance, the Danish documentary Your Neighbor's Son.